I work with Remax Home Connections. If you've done a deal with Alexis Pearson in the last 2 years, you've probably also worked with me. So nice to meet you guys. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest. Joining us today is Bill Dedman. Bill is a Pulitzer Prize winner, a Peabody Award winner. He's an investigative reporter. You guys might be a little bit more familiar with him as one of the lead reporters for the Newsday Long Island Divide investigation. We're going to be playing some of the clips today if you haven't seen it. But if you haven't, I strongly advise you guys to go watch the documentary. It's very eye-opening to a lot of the fair housing violations and kind of discrimination that's still present in our industry today. So Bill, thank you for joining us. If you want to kind of join in real quick.
Sure. Thank you, Caitlin. I really appreciate you and Heather and everyone helping make this possible. It's exciting really to have this opportunity to share with you our team's work on fair housing. I really appreciate this invitation. It's surprising. It's sort of gratifying that so many real estate associations around the country have embraced work by a team of journalists and are using it to provoke an important conversation like this one. Partly what I'm hoping we can do is to look at some video clips together of agents in action, admittedly not on their best days. But mostly I'm hoping that we can discuss a few of the implications of this investigation. We can talk about schools, about new training opportunities, and maybe we can examine some of the fixes for unequal treatment in real estate. My assumption is that you as real estate professionals will have your own reactions and your own thoughts. And what I'm hoping is that this will be helpful to you to develop those and challenging, something for you to think back and to think about and to take back to your brokerage to take action on.
Absolutely. So just to kind of dive right in, you won the Pulitzer Prize for an investigation into mortgage lending practices. So I thought it might be kind of interesting for our viewers just to hear a brief summary of that investigation and just to kind of show how long you've been doing this and really the breadth of your work.
Well, to take a minute about that, the Atlanta newspaper stories were called The Color of Money. This was in the late 1980s. These were about redlining, about the practice of mortgage lenders doing business in one part of the map, but not another. At that time, redlining had earlier gotten a lot of attention and activism, but it seemed to be thought of as something from the past that wasn't happening anymore. And we found the lenders in Atlanta making home loans in white areas, even lower income white areas, but not in black areas, even higher income black areas where Coretta Scott King and the mayor and the executives from Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola lived. And for me, one of the keys was that we looked at how the banks were operating in Atlanta. We found small differences, you might think of as small differences, that had a huge impact. Where branches had been closed and were opened, which real estate agents were marketed to and there were special programs for, and which didn't hear from the lenders at all. Where customers could put in a loan application even. So for me, it was a lesson in how maybe unintentional actions or policies could maintain a segregated system, maybe without anyone thinking that that was a goal. I'd also like to mention another project later in Boston about what we call racial profiling in traffic stops in Massachusetts, or to put it another way, once you're stopped, who gets a ticket? This project was called Speed Trap. And the interesting thing about being stopped by an officer for speeding is that you were speeding, we were all speeding, but you have no way to know if you're getting equal treatment. If you get a break, if you get a warning, you have no way to know if everybody got one that day. If you got a ticket, you don't know if the officer was treating you more harshly than someone else. It's sort of like being a real estate customer. You only know your experience. And what we found in Massachusetts was that who gets a ticket, not a warning, is easy to predict if you know the race and sex and age of the driver. For example, women got a break, especially younger women up to about age 40. It's just like who gets roles in Hollywood. Minorities rarely got a break, always got the ticket, especially Black and Latino men. And so there seemed to be some racial profiling at work in a group, among a group of people who all were speeding. So in that case, and with the banks, what we were doing as journalists was looking at public records later to see how the system worked and to raise questions about, you know, how it operated, who did what. And I think what's different about Long Island Divided, about our work on real estate, is that we're not coming along later looking at records. With the video cameras, body cams, we can watch people violating the law. And I also think it matters that we name names, that you can see faces and names on the screen. The other stories were about, you know, pervasive issues like this, but those were sort of focused on the banks or focused on the police. But here you can see specific agents, and you'll see names and faces, names of their brokerages. And I think that made a difference in sort of the impact of it.
Yeah, I think that really kind of brings it home. You know, it's like this specific agent and this specific firm. So the Newsday investigation has become probably the most prominent example of race-based bias in real estate. What kicked off the investigation? What started it from the beginning?
Yeah, so Katie, so we were, well, first think about what Long Island is. It's so large you can see it on a map of the United States. It's east of New York City, the island stretching out into the Atlantic, and it ends at the famous area of the Hamptons, the wealthy playground for the rich. But what you have is two counties with about 3 million people on Long Island. And it's a heavily segregated suburb. And what we mean by that is that although there are people from all nationalities and races, a lot of diversity overall, people are in their little communities, more than 200 communities and more than 200 school districts. And especially African Americans of whatever income are concentrated in very few communities. More than half of the African Americans live in only 8 of those more than 200 communities. And we had long heard anecdotes from Black home buyers encountering problems when they tried to buy a home in a white or somewhat integrated area outside of those communities. Now, testing is commonly done by fair housing groups and some government agencies sending out pairs of renters or home buyers. And it's really the only way to see how different customers in the same situation are treated. We also were sparked by an anniversary. The 50th anniversary of the Federal Fair Housing Act was approaching. And we wanted to see, using the methods of fair housing groups, what had changed, how things were working then. We added to the methods of the fair housing groups hidden cameras for video and audio. That's legal in New York. It's legal in most states, including North Carolina. Most state laws require only one party to a conversation, and in this case, that can be the tester, a home buyer, to consent to audio recording. Hidden audio recording is not legal in about a dozen states, but there can still be testing there because testers can be debriefed afterwards, or you can look at the listings that they were given. But why don't we dive into a first little bit of our documentary film. The film is called Testing the Divide. It's about 40 minutes, and you'll find it and all the stories on the Newsday site. Newsday.com/divided is the address for everything. The problem that's highlighted in this first clip is what we thought of as just a barrier to entry. One customer is not served, doesn't get service, although she's in the same situation as a customer who does get service.
So before we play the clip, can you give us like a summary of the test in general and kind of who was tested and what was the outcome?
Yeah, yeah, okay, I'll give you that, and then we can come back and play that clip. We focused on home sales. We were sending out first-time home buyers. We're doing no rental testing. These were all home buyers, and they'd go out one at a time representing their couple, shopping for my wife and I, or my husband and I. They went to see the same agent. We'd send out a white home buyer and then separately an Asian home buyer, or a pair that was white and then later black, or white and then Hispanic. We'd mix up actually who went first to see the agent. And it's important to understand that the testers always gave the same circumstances and the same constraints on their home search. So they were sort of following the same script. We chose people of the same gender, roughly the same age. They were dressed in the same sort of business casual style. In fact, we chose similar style and price range purses for the women to carry. We provided similar shirts for the men to wear. They were asking about the same geographic area, within half an hour of downtown or within 20 minutes of this community. They were asking about the same, they had the same family size and wanted the same number of bedrooms. And they were prepared to have the same income or credit scores presented to the agent if they were asked, but hardly ever was anyone asked any financial information beyond mortgage pre-approval status, which they were asked and had the same situation for both testers. We shopped for homes in different price ranges. In New York area prices, entry level is about $400,000 on Long Island. So that was our low end. And we went up to a high end of $7 million for our tests. But it was always the same price range given for both of the testers. And it's important that they saw the same agent. Now, understand that that wouldn't really be necessary for a fair housing lawsuit or investigation. Two different agents at the same brokerage are also supposed to treat customers equally. But we thought it would be more fair and more persuasive to have the same agent see both customers. Now, we did 86 of these matched tests, seeing more than 90 brokers, agents, because sometimes more than one agent worked in a pair or a team. They went to 12 companies or brands. We chose these because they represented more than half of the sellers in our market. They dominated the market on Long Island. Familiar names: Coldwell Banker, Keller Williams, Century 21, Remax, as well as the large regional brands like Corcoran, ones that are especially strong in our area. And we tested each company many times. The testing was done by people we hired to do it. We didn't go out as journalists, but we trained 25 testers. Some came from church groups, but mostly we used out-of-work actors, because there's a lot of out-of-work actors in New York, and they can learn a script. We trained them with their identities, how to answer questions in a neutral way. We wanted to make sure that the testers weren't doing the steering. We dressed them the same, and we rigged up their video cameras, and the testers would meet with the agents, receive listings, and go on home tours. Our journalists handled the communication with the agents. In other words, posing as the testers, we would do the emailing and the texting with agents, because we wanted to make sure that it was all done in a neutral way, and we had a record of it. And our team then watched all this video, more than 200 hours of video, to see how the customers were treated. And we analyzed the thousands of listings that they had received to see what school districts and communities they were in. And that's where we saw a big difference. We didn't feel comfortable deciding who was in bounds and who was breaking the law or not. That wasn't our role. So we had two fair housing experts as consultants on the project, reviewing each test for evidence of unequal treatment. One of these had run a testing program for the Department of Justice and works with fair housing groups. and the other is the law professor who wrote the textbook on fair housing law. We presented all the information to them, and only if both of our referees independently called someone out of bounds did we throw the flag. We gave the agents, by the way, and the brokerages the details and let them come in to watch the videos before we published anything so we could get their responses. And we put the videos online so everyone can see them, and you can see the maps of the listings given to each buyer. And you can read what our experts had to say about each case. This was my point is that this was a careful effort. It took more than 3 years. This was not a drive-by investigation to get a YouTube video. Now, can we play this first clip?
Let's go ahead and play the clip, and then we can kind of go over the results.
We'll come back, and I'm going to give you the results of the test.
Perfect.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood.
Mixed neighborhood.
If agents are courteous and professional, how can you know that they're treating you equally compared with someone of a different race or ethnicity?
I have to say it without saying it, you know.
Behind smiles and handshakes, how do you know if they're giving you fewer options or suggesting different areas?
I'm not going to send you anything you want unless you don't want to store your car to buy your friend.
Or that rules don't apply to you and another home buyer in the same way.
Yeah, okay, I definitely need that.
Long Island is one of America's most segregated suburbs. Newsday set out to discover what role real estate agents might play in keeping it that way, potentially affecting the quality of lives.
Technically, as a real estate agent, we shouldn't tell you, the buyers.
In house hunting, it's nearly impossible to see evidence of hidden discrimination. You would never know unless you go undercover.
In one test, Johnny Mae Alston was the black tester and Cindy Parry was the white tester. And they met with
Anne-Marie Quealy-Bichon at Signature Premier Properties office in Cold Spring Harbor.
They asked for the same thing. As often happens, the agent discussed getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a mortgage by a bank, showing how much a buyer can spend on a house.
Pre-qualified, I guess. My husband's working with somebody in a bank. We've done some preliminary talks, about getting pre-approved.
Neither had been pre-approved or pre-qualified. Here's what the agent told the black tester.
So I really need that. I won't take out anyone unless you have a pre-qualification letter. So I need to. So that means I can't pre-qualify for a mortgage. Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
And without pre-approval, here's what the agent told the white tester.
What is your availability? When can you start looking at houses? I would say not this coming week.
Cindy received 79 listings from this agent. Johnny Mae couldn't get any listings. And Cindy, the white tester, received 2 home tours. They had the same finances, the same budget, and they made the same request in the same area. But one was white, the other was black. The agent treated them differently.
Now, let me talk about the results. Overall, the agents gave unequal treatment in 40% of our tests, 4 out of 10. But the results were not the same for each type of pair. Let me explain. 19% of the time, Asian buyers, 2 out of 10 Asian buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts. 39% of the time, 4 out of 10 Hispanic buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts. And 49% of the time, 5 out of 10 black buyers were treated differently than the whites they were paired with. Now, most of the attention has been on that high difference for black customers, and that makes sense in light of what's going on in racial issues in the country and now, and also historic discrimination. But let's don't lose sight of the rest. If 4 out of 10 Hispanic buyers or 2 out of 10 Asian buyers are treated poorly half a century after the civil rights laws were passed, then those struck us as high numbers as well. We viewed this as testing the gatekeepers in real estate to see how they were performing. We don't suggest that these results could be generalized and you'd get the same percentage nationally, but we do think it's fair to say that most of these major national and real estate companies were contributing to the racial segregation in our suburbs. I guess the question you have to ask yourself is, would the results be substantially the same if we repeated the tests in your community, in Charlotte, in Atlanta, Houston, or Detroit? Let me describe some of the differences that we saw. Most of the differences we would classify as steering. Black buyers just got fewer listings than white, the wider the area was. So let's say both testers are asking about an area, within 20 minutes of Brentwood. Well, if a white area is in that, or mostly white areas in that search for both of them, the black buyer would often not get any listings in that white area. The wider the area, the less likely the black buyer was to get any listings there. Overall, agents directed a quarter of our minority home buyers into different communities and different school districts altogether than their white counterparts. 1 out of 4 times that happened, just completely different areas. Along with that, there were agents who refused to serve customers, like in that example based on pre-approval being a barrier for one and not another. There also were cases where agents wouldn't help our Black or Hispanic buyer without signing an exclusive contract with that agent, but the same agent wasn't requiring a contract to help our white buyer. And we were surprised. There were inappropriate comments by agents. We're long past the days of just blatant, open, whites only kind of discrimination. It's subtler now. And one interesting quirk of this was that inappropriate comments were made by agents, but they were only said to our white home buyers. Minority buyers rarely heard anything inappropriate, or they would come back and they would say, she was so nice. That agent was really nice. Here's a video clip highlighting the problem of inappropriate comments.
Hispanic community came in, and they really took over Springs and Northwest Woods area.
Here, an agent gives conflicting advice about Freeport.
I like Freeport. Now you have a bad school district, and that's not good for resale value.
All the school bus, see the moms that are hanging out on the corners.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood. It's been the United Nations.
Because you might be more comfortable in a certain demographic area that isn't heavily one way or another in terms of the people.
Bayshore has 2 school districts, Brentwood and Bayshore. You don't want to have Brentwood school districts. You want to have Bayshore school district.
I can't say anything, but I encourage you. I want you to go there at 10 o'clock at night with your wife to buy diapers. Go to that 7-Eleven. They didn't buy there.
No, that's great.
I have to say it without saying it. You have the knowledge of the areas.
Yes.
I don't want to use the word steer, but I try to I'll use another word.
Hey, listen,
Educated the areas.
That's... Yeah. How are you, Russ? Hey, Russ. Good. How are you?
We're either waiting for the owner or waiting for the agent to show up.
You don't want to be. I don't think you should be in Elmont. I think you should probably just be Franklin Square.
And I remember specifically, he talked about steering.
Yes, that's what he said. Steering, yeah.
Yeah. And in the same breath, he mentioned, well, steering's bad, but this is what I'm going to do.
There's something called steering. No steering, like steering.
Oh, like a car or something?
No, like a horse, even.
Oh.
You know, like a horse, even.
Yeah, and in the same breath, he mentioned, well, steering's bad, but this is what I'm going to do.
No, steering, no steering, you know, like steering. Oh, like a car or something? No, like a horse, even.
add that the inappropriate comments are easy to focus on. They sort of, generate a lot of heat. We got a sense that some agents may have gotten the message through training or through the years that complying with the fair housing laws means not saying the wrong thing, as though it's some sort of a political correctness fence, or not saying the wrong thing to the wrong person who might complain about it. It might be that we need more attention to steering to differential treatment. In other words, on what agents do, what listings they provide, what service they provide, instead of what comments they might make. And are they giving the same advice to all clients? Are they treating all clients equally?
So in that last clip, it kind of touches on steering. And I think everybody here has a general understanding of what steering is, but can you kind of tell us a little bit more about what's meant by exactly that term?
Yes, the discrimination took several forms, and steering is an imprecise term. It's not really a legal term, but it's often used as a catch-all for various behaviors. So here's one way to think about it. Showing one person an apartment while telling another person that no apartments are available. That's steering. Telling one person that you won't find any housing in that area in your price range, but showing housing in that price range to others in that area. We saw that. Asking one customer for ID, but not the other customer. We saw that. Making unsolicited comments about the race or ethnicity or religion of people who live in an area, or the schools, or crime, or resale values as a way of encouraging or discouraging someone from living there is steering, especially while giving contrary information or being silent on those matters to another customer. We heard agents tell white buyers to avoid an area because of poor resale values while encouraging a minority buyer to shop there. Or just providing more service to one group than another is steering. Overall, our white testers got more listings than their black counterparts, 50% more listings on average. It was much more equal, not exact, but more equal for Asian and Hispanic buyers with whites. Now, we've been talking about it in terms of sort of treating different people differently, but let's take a moment to think about this from a neighborhood perspective. If you look at it neighborhood by neighborhood across all our tests, we had mostly white communities where nearly all the listings given to either buyer were given to the white buyer in the whiter communities. That was one pattern. But we also had something else. You've got there minorities being shut out of those whiter communities. But we also had minority communities or communities with even a middling amount of minority residents where no one got listings. It's in the search area, it's in the price range, homes are for sale, but the agents are steering around those communities, especially those with black population, for both buyers, white or black, white or Hispanic, white or Asian, being steered around homes for sale in black areas. And our legal experts looked at that and they said, well, now who would have the case? Who's got the fair housing lawsuit in that case? And they said, well, it's the community can sue the brokerage. The sellers of homes, anyone who's tried to sell a home in the past 10 years in those communities and their listing agents are the ones who have a case against the brokers who are steering around, harming their resale value and the equity that they have in their homes. Now, I want to make clear that we're not saying that real estate agents created segregation in the suburbs. Many of you have probably read Richard Rothstein's wonderful book from the last couple of years called The Color of Law, which tells this history and lays segregation at the feet of government action back to the 1930s in the New Deal days, with racial covenants allowed to limit who could buy a property and forbidding sales of property to people of color. And most importantly, making financing available only to white buyers when the suburbs were developed. The modern suburbs were fueled by money lent to developers and veterans after World War II, money that was available only to white developers for white buyers. And, you know, the professor really focuses on the government action in that case, not the action of appraisers or lenders or real estate agents. I do think it's fair to say that through the years, realtors have tended, not all, but have tended to follow these lines that were laid down long ago, not creating segregation, but maybe helping reinforce those boundaries. Let me show you a video clip with sort of a classic example of steering. I don't see how you could have a better example of steering. One man and his wife and teenager are warned against living in a community when the same agent tells another man and his wife and teenager that it has nice people and would be a good place to live.
Kelvin Toon is a black man in his early 50s, and he went in to meet with an agent involving a test in the Brentwood community, a community that is 80% Hispanic and black. The agent communicated to Kelvin, our black tester, that she enjoyed meeting with clients from the Brentwood area.
Every time I get a new listing in Brentwood or a new client, I get so excited because they're the nicest people.
When we sent Kelvin's counterpart in to meet with the same agent, the white tester was actually warned about Brentwood not being a nice place.
The nursing home we need to be near is in Brentwood.
Okay.
And so we found a couple that are in Brentwood.
Pretty close to each other.
Okay. And it just seemed like those would be handy also for going.
Do you want to give me them and I'll look into them for you? Or?
Yeah, I can do that.
That warning came later to the white testers saying there was concern about gang activity going on in Brentwood. This agent wanted the white tester to know, but that information wasn't provided to Kelvin, the black tester. The listings centered black tester Kelvin in Brentwood with 27 house listings, while the white tester got 0 listings in Brentwood and was directed towards much whiter neighborhoods.
So, Bill, do you think that the agents included in the documentary are doing this on purpose, that they're knowingly steering? And I mean, it's obvious that some of them are just based on their statements, but for the rest of them, do you think it's intentional or do you think it's like an unconscious bias?
I think this is a really important topic to discuss. The first point to lay down is that it doesn't matter. The Fair Housing Act and the local laws and state laws cover behavior, not thoughts or motives. The law is not a mind reader. Burglary is illegal even if you didn't intend to be a burglar. If you're treating one person better than another, similarly situated person, and the difference between them is one of the 7 categories in the Fair Housing Act, you violated the law. I'm going to remind you of those categories: color, race, religion, national origin, disability, sex, and family status, which we usually take to mean having children or being pregnant. And you also would have state and may have local laws that could include other categories, marital status, sexual orientation, et cetera. But even though it doesn't matter legally, I think it is important for us to consider the motivations of the agents. You need to think, why is this happening if you're going to stop it, right? One possibility is that some agents may in effect be profiling, assuming that the person of color can't really afford homes in that price range that they've stated, or can't really qualify for the mortgage, will be wasting their time. While accepting that same price range without question from a white buyer. Profiling is really sort of a shortcut that people use. One of the tricky things about profiling is that it's so ineffective. we talk about profiling usually as though, it's a shortcut to the right thing, but it might be illegal, or it might be a human rights violation, or somehow politically incorrect. But the experts who study profiling in different areas say that the real problem with it is that it doesn't work. Let's say you want to stop school shooters, and you've got an idea that kids who dress a certain way or play video games or are quiet, those are your school shooters, and you focus your investigative attention on them. Well, you see the problem. You're likely to miss kids who are dangerous and acquiring weapons and actually taking steps and making threats, and you might be putting too much attention on kids who are innocent. Religion is not a good way to identify who will be a terrorist. Race is not a good way to identify which customer can afford a home. So it's ineffective counterterrorism work, it's ineffective policing, it's ineffective real estate sales. Besides, it's illegal. I think the best way to crystallize, those of you of a certain age, my age, will remember the film Pretty Woman. And you remember the scene where Julia Roberts, dressed as a prostitute, can't get served on the fancy shops on Rodeo Drive, can't buy clothes. But she's got the credit card, she buys clothes, she comes back the next day, beautifully dressed, and goes into the shop, and they don't recognize her dressed the way she is. And she says, "Do you work on commission?" "You do." Big mistake. She holds up her shopping bags from the other stores. Huge. "Well, I've got to go shopping," right? She's profiling costs that clerk money. That's the way to think about profiling. Some agents may also think that they'll make money faster with less effort if they show people homes where they'll feel comfortable. You heard someone say that. But why assume that people want to live in segregated neighborhoods? That's not the case for everyone. And besides, it's illegal. Some agents may also, I suspect it's a very small group, may have some sort of anti-minority bias or discrimination. I'm imagining that's just not the bulk of the problem. Some sort of open, fervent racist feeling. That's just not what's going on here. Good agents, good right-thinking people have been steering for many years. It also is possible that some agents may not really be profiling for themselves, but maybe acting out of sort of a referred bias. If you have a toothache, it may be because your shoulder hurts. They may not be biased themselves, but they might be sort of yielding to bias they expect in the market. They might expect that potential sellers would be angry if the agent brought minority buyers to the home, or that the neighbors might be angry, and the neighbors are potential customers, potential sellers themselves. Or the agent might think that appraisers or lenders would be biased. It might be harder to close a sale and a waste of time. And again, none of that matters. In general, on issues of race, it's easy to sort of apply all the heat to this question of, is it intentional? As though if it were not intentional, it wouldn't also be illegal. It's much more productive to apply light to the question, how does it work? How do we do it? Is what we're doing treating people differently? If not, how can we fix that? Under the law, it's what you do that counts. I think it's also real important to think about this from the perspective of the home buyer. In these cases, they were testers, and our testers were entirely unaware that they were being treated better or worse. They would only see the differences when our team would bring the buyers together to watch the videos. I want to introduce you here in a video clip to some of our testers, and you'll hear from the fair housing expert who often works with them in the middle of this clip.
It almost makes me wish that the racism is more explicit so that I would know about it.
Too often I hear people who maybe aren't as familiar with this kind of work say, oh, well, they were just testers. But all you have to do is tell someone, which I have to do on a fairly regular basis, that you were turned down because of your race and tell them the circumstances that occurred on a particular test, and you will see just how real and painful that injury is.
Elmont, it's okay, it's good, you're very close to the city. Some of them are not as nice, Elmont.
I do remember him, he was nice, and I do remember him pointing out on the map.
Oh, he loved that map. I remember that.
Yeah, he had the map, and he's like,
Some of these towns, in my opinion, are not necessarily the greatest in terms of school districts, safety, crime, resale.
One of the things that sort of startled us was how often agents began their presentations to new customers with material that sort of that violated the Fair Housing Act. That surprised us. It surprised us how often the presentation began with that kind of don't stop in any of those communities. And I hate to say it, but it seemed as though for those agents, steering was the service that they were selling.
I think it's really unfortunate too, because like it touches on, it's you don't really see that it's happening until you see it side by side, and how often do you really get to see that in the real world? So, and I know when I mentioned the videos previously had mentioned like the school districts. So did you guys pay special attention to it? What role did the schools kind of play in the agents' actions?
Yes, agents repeatedly told us everything is done by schools. Schools are how segregation happens in America, because schools are so segregated. It's hard for us to realize that America's school districts overall are more segregated now than they were 30 years ago. So agents would say one school was blue ribbon but the other's declining, and they would then give different information or be silent on that to different buyers. Around the country, some agents have picked up on the idea that you can't talk about schools. Oh, I can't mention schools. But the Fair Housing Act doesn't say that. It says agents give straightforward factual information or answer questions. You can answer if someone asks you, where did your kids go to school? The problem arises when the agents are picking and choosing different districts for different customers, or making comments about demographics to steer buyers. Here's a discussion about schools. We spend quite a bit of our film talking about that. Here's just 2 minutes on that, where you'll hear our law professor discuss it. This is a clip.
Sorry, technical difficulties. Hold on. Sorry.
Okay. If you need me to share it, I will.
If you please, yes, that would be fantastic.
Okay, I will.
I don't know where all the videos just went. They were all right there just a second ago.
That's okay. I'm going to play it for you. Everybody just give me half a second. Just half a second. We'll be there. Yeah, there we go. We're going to get there.
We're going to try and stay away from Freeport, Roosevelt, Hempstead for now because of the school district.
This part, the Salisbury part, is in demand because the schools are much, much, much better.
In Newsday's 86 paired tests, agents often applied a laser-like focus on school districts, highlighting their perceived quality when recommending places that house hunters should consider buying or avoid. Fair housing experts say touting or disparaging school districts can put agents in jeopardy because talking about school districts can be taken as a euphemism for race.
There's a few districts that I know I would I won't look in those towns.
Oh, okay.
Like Freeport and Baldwin and Amityville, which is part of Massapequa schools, but it's just certain parts of Massapequa.
If the customer asked about the quality of the schools and the agent responded with accurate information, I think the agent would be fine. The problem with talking about differentials in schools is that at least in the last 10 or 15 years, that has been a proxy for race. They don't mention the race of the community. Good schools are available in these areas. Those areas I'd stay away from because they have poor schools. I want to ask, did you tell that to the other tester? If you're only giving that information to one tester of the two, and the only difference is the race, then you've provided what I call differential service.
You only, if you're in Massapequa, you only want school district 23. Okay. You don't want 6 in Massapequa because that takes in Amityville, and we're not going to like those schools.
You know, the one thing to remember is that you don't have to talk about race to be steering. And quote, good schools are really a pitfall, especially because, write this on the blackboard 100 times, school test scores don't tell you how good a school is. School test scores tell you mostly how wealthy are the parents and how educated are the parents who send their kids to that school. Wealth in America is a very good predictor of test scores, and race in America is a very good predictor of wealth. So there's a very high correlation between wealth and education of parents and school test scores. So a high performing school is often one with higher educated parents, and a lower performing school might actually be the higher performing one, bringing up the scores of students who are growing up with fewer advantages. Greatschools.org, the school ranking website, has realized this, and so many realtors rely on it. And it's realized that, in effect, just using test scores to rank schools is perpetuating segregation. So Great Schools has recently changed its rankings and is trying to broaden, get more information, and not rank schools only on test scores. And the National Association of Realtors has spoken up in favor of this change and is trying to look more carefully at what's the best way to talk about schools. What they realize that they need to give you better advice, though they know that you can say factual information. But the gray area is when labels come into it, like good or nice or high performing, because often that's perpetuating this idea that whiter schools are better schools. Now, let me give you a little bit of the reaction to our stories. I don't want to focus on it too much, but there may be some discipline against some of the agents involved. We weren't focusing on trying to cause such discipline for them. If we had, we would be testing the individual agents multiple times. We were thinking of it more from a company perspective. There have been hearings where the brokers and the agents were called to testify and were sworn in, and that's online. And I think it's two notable things happened in that. First, the brokers said, we've studied these cases and we didn't find that anybody did anything wrong at all. And the senators weren't buying that. The agent who said, follow the school buses and see what the mothers look like on the corners, she was asked, why did you say that? And she said, well, I just wanted people to know where the school bus routes were. The senators weren't buying that, and the state disciplinary people may not buy that either. But the other key thing that happened at the hearing was that the head of Realogy, the company that owns the Century 21 and Coldwell Banker brands and Sotheby's International Real Estate and others, the biggest real estate company in America, their CEO testified at the hearing and said, we should be testing our own agents. We should be self-testing. And the National Association of Realtors has started developing a self-testing program, sort of a plug and play thing that they can share with companies to help companies quickly get up to speed if they want to test their own agents. You may see more testing from HUD or government agencies, especially in a new presidential administration. But it would be a huge game changer if companies were testing their own agents.
Absolutely. So based on your investigations and just kind of all of your work, how would you advise agents, or what would you say the best, tools for us to kind of combat racism and discrimination in real estate?
Well, so quickly, I just want to mention some of what NAR is doing. NAR has a new program called ACT, A for accountability, C for culture change, and T for training. And I just want to mention a couple of elements of those. NAR is working with state associations to look at state laws on licensing and enforcement of fair housing to see if they're all meeting a national standard for holding agents accountable. So that's very different. You may know that NAR has made a national apology about historic discrimination, and culture change is really part of this. And NAR says they think that'll be the hardest part. You know that, for example, complying with fair housing laws is part of the code of ethics for realtors. You may not know that complying with segregation was part of that same code of ethics during my lifetime. It was against the code of ethics of a realtor to sell African-American a home in a white area. In other words, let's acknowledge that cultures can be changed, and changing cultures is probably the hardest part, not some set of rules. And there's a long history of redlining and blockbusting and subprime lending that needs to be overcome. The training is interesting. I think the most exciting part of this that NAR has put out is a new product called Fair Haven. And you can find it on the Realtor website, and you have to be a Realtor to log in to use it. And it's like a game, a simulation. And some of you, I'm sure, have done it. It takes about an hour and a half to go through it. And you go through the home purchase process and sale process, and you can sort of see the pitfalls of fair housing and answer questions and see how you're doing. And I think that kind of role playing has great promise as a way to educate people about, the problems of buyer love letters, the problems of steering, et cetera. One thing we found in New York was that the training was very poor. Fair housing training was already required of all agents, and it was pretty slipshod, a little jokey. And after our stories came out, the state association stopped all training and is rewriting the curriculum and the training materials. So I think that attention to better fair housing training is definitely worth the effort. NAR is also making a film about good role models. And by the way, 2 of the 12 companies we tested, everyone passed. These were 2 of the local regional brands. All their agents treated people fairly. And that kind of good example ought to be highlighted. Let me just add one sort of layman's perspective of mine, which is that maybe more attention needs to be paid in just what happens, a checklist when you have a new customer. We often saw customers come back from the same agent, one with a fat folder and one with a skinny folder of information. If you're giving the schools brochure to one person, give it to everybody. And that seems like something that brokerages could have some impact on. If you're asking an ID question, if you're asking about income, if you're going to treat everybody without a mortgage pre-qualification or pre-approval, then do the same for everyone else. That kind of standardization might be helpful because it increases the chances that people are treated equally. My sort of layman's view is why do realtors need to be steering people to some neighborhoods and not others at all? Customers may ask for it, but is it really the right role for a real estate agent to be picking and choosing neighborhoods, clicking on, oh, we're going to include these communities in your search, but not those communities on your search in the MLS. So it might be that a fix for illegal steering is not to steer, to give people all the listings. Diversifying the workforce may help. Having more brokerages and offices in minority areas might help, so there's more familiarity with those communities and they're not being steered around completely. But I personally having watched this for 3 years, put more faith in standardization, some role playing so people can see the implications of their actions, and maybe cutting down on just steering at all, making choices for the buyers. Why not give them all the listings? My assumption is that all of you want to make sure that everybody who calls or emails or someday walks back in your office is treated fairly. That's my assumption. And so what I hope you'll do is share our project with your Facebook friends and your customers and your colleagues. When we can all get back together, have a popcorn hour and watch the film together. And but not from the point of view of who's the racist in our office, or I heard Joe say something once. Not from that point of view, but from the point of view of starting a conversation about, well, how does it work? And some of us are part-time, we're very independent, we're not always in the office together. In that environment, how can we increase the chances that everybody we encounter gets the same fair shake? To think of it more from that operational engineering, how does it work kind of standpoint. That's what I'm hoping you'll do with our work. Thank you. Katie, you may have other questions and I'll be glad to tackle them.
Well, I think what we'll probably do, well, first of all, thank you for coming to talk with us. I've watched the video before. A couple of our agents in the office, we all kind of sat down and watched it together. And if anyone here hasn't watched it, I really hope y'all will sit down and watch the full, it's I think 40 minute documentary. I don't think anybody can't stand to learn something. You know, I don't think there's a single agent that can say we can't do better. There's not something I can work on and something I can't improve. So I really hope that everybody kind of takes that back and really takes a step back and kind of looks at yourself and says, what can I do better? So thank you for coming to talk with us. And I think what we'll probably do is go to the chat box. And if anybody has any questions, we can kind of read through them now. So.
I will, Carrie, I see your question about where to find the link. It's at newsday.com/divided, and I'll post the link again for anybody that joined after I had posted it initially in the chat.
Yeah, that takes you to the full stories. Everything's there. And if you scroll down just a page or so, you'll see the video on that same page as the stories. It's all there.
And then just real quick, one question that I did have when we were going through it, you mentioned that like the school ranking website, they're trying to steer away from just going by test scores. What other criteria are they kind of trying to bring in? Is there any talk about it yet?
Well, it's hard because, you know, Great Schools is including, you know, comments from parents and others, you know, and of course those could have bias built in or you know, you can get a lot of chaff with that wheat too. The best thing really would be to look at advancement of students. You know, is reading proficiency better in the 5th grade and the 7th grade than it was in the 3rd grade? That sort of thing is better. So there might even be ways to use test scores that are more sophisticated. I mean, that's really the hardest, because are the schools good is the question that you all know that you get so often.
Okay, great. Does anybody have any other questions that they would like to ask Mr. Dedman? I think that's about it then.
Well, thank you.
Heather, you have something?
I think that we're good. The chat is not filling up with anything, so
we're good. You're all missing a great snow day up here in the Northeast. I know that you're sad about that.
Yeah, we're all very jealous.
So very.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for your invitation and for your attention. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Welcome back for everyone who was here for the first presentation. And if you're just joining, welcome. So today we've got Stephen Fussell with us. He's going to be going over commission complaints and kind of pitfalls for agents. He's the Chief Consumer Protection Officer with the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. So Steve, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I am also joined by Dee Bigelow, who is one of the commission's information officers. She didn't know that I was going to introduce her, but she's with us today and she's doing a great job. If you call the commission to ask a question about transactions or anything regarding your real estate business, there's a 50-50 chance that Dee will be the person you'll speak with, along with either Pete Myers. The rest of us sort of pitch in and answer questions whenever Dee and Pete are not available. So she will be here, and if there's a question I can't answer, I'm sure Dee can. So yeah, as Heather was saying, I just want to talk to you about the 10 most common complaints that the commission has gotten this year. It's been a weird year, as I'm sure it has been for you. And while some of the types of topics have been consistent, we've had some new issues come up as well. And just want to give you a sort of a feel for what the commission deals with on an annual basis. This year and last year, we've had about 2,000 complaints. That's complaints against real estate brokers and firms. About 80% of our investigations will be done by letter inquiry, which means that we send letters to everybody involved in a situation to gather information. About 20% of our investigations are done by field investigation. And that's where we send someone out to your office to interview you, review your records, that kind of thing. When we send a letter out, prior to the pandemic, we were actually sending letters by snail mail, as you might call it, or US Postal Service. However, once the pandemic started and we had the stay-at-home orders, the commission staff, probably like you, started working from home. And while I'm talking to you from my office today, most of the time I'm working from home, as you probably are. And so instead of sending letters out by mail, we're sending letters by email. So it's very important that you keep your license record updated at the commission to make sure the commission has your current email address, because that's how, for the most part, we're going to be sending letters out, is by email now. But there still may be an occasion where we send something out by regular mail. And for example, if we try to send something to you by email, and if it bounces back, then we may send something by regular mail. There are other things that the commission does send by regular mail that don't have anything to do with complaints. And just know that if the commission sends something to you, it's not going to be junk mail. So please make sure you've got some kind of procedure set up with your broker in charge, so that any mail that comes to you from the commission, you're going to actually receive it. If the commission writes to you about a complaint, you've got 14 days from the day you receive the letter to respond. The commission understands that you may not be in your office when a letter comes, or you may not be at home. You might be on vacation for Christmas. You might be in the hospital with the coronavirus, or you may be somewhere else. You've got 14 days from the day you receive a letter from us to respond. And if you get back from a vacation, or you get home from the hospital and you see that you've got an email from me or someone else at the commission, just give us a call and say, hey, I just got home. I see your email, or I just got your letter. Can I have extra time to respond? And 99% of the time we're going to say yes. And so we'll say, yeah, you can have an extra couple of weeks, or you can have until the end of the month. You know, something we'll make a note of that, so that you don't have to worry about sending anything to commemorate that conversation. A lot of times we get questions, you know, brokers asking, do they need to hire an attorney? The answer is no. You're certainly welcome to hire an attorney if a complaint is filed against you, but it's not a requirement. And just understand that the Real Estate Commission fully understands that that not everything in a complaint is going to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We view a complaint as a starting point, so that if we get a complaint, that's just going to be the starting point for our investigation. We typically communicate with everybody involved. So if it's a sales transaction, we're going to write to the listing agent, the buyer's agent. If the complaint was filed by the buyer, we're going to possibly write to the seller. We may reach out to the closing attorney or the home inspector or anybody else who we think might have some information to offer that will help us better understand what happened in the situation. Because it's all about, for us, trying to understand what really happened. We don't assume that the complaining witness has told us everything that happened. So that's what we're going to do. The topics that we're going to talk about today include race relations, flipping, material facts, unauthorized access, offer and acceptance, where's the money, inspections, tenant issues, landlord issues, and wire fraud. I'm curious, how many of you in the audience today are involved in property management? Okay, so at least some of you. Okay, so that's why I tailored this presentation to address some property management issues. And even those of you who don't typically do property management on a day-to-day basis, you might have a buyer who comes in who says, I want to rent for 6 months, get familiar with the community, and then I'll be ready to buy. Or you may have a buyer who says, I'm looking for a property to buy, and then I'm going to want to lease it out. I'm buying it as an investment property. So some of these issues are going to apply to everybody. So that's why I included a little bit for everybody in this presentation. I'm going to start out with race relations because it's a fairly new topic for us, but it's something that the commission takes very seriously. I cannot overstate how serious the commission views this, to the extent that the commission actually put a commitment to racial equality on the commission's website. And I want to read that to you. But I want you to take, for the next 60 seconds, I want you to close your eyes, and I'm going to read this racial equity statement to you. And it says, the Real Estate Commission members and its staff are deeply saddened by the senseless death of George Floyd and far too many other people of color. We grieve with our fellow Americans and with people across the world over these senseless losses. These deaths and the resulting protests have affected all of us in some way and have shown the importance of compassionate and open discussion about issues of racial inequities. Those involved in the real estate brokerage business are a diverse community. The commission is committed to the principles of excellence, fairness, and respect for all people. It is our goal to ensure that brokerage activities are conducted in fairness to all, to ensure equal housing opportunities, and to end discrimination in the sale or rental of all real estate. Everyone should feel safe in their communities and should feel safe and be free from discrimination. We stand with those who seek equal justice for all and will do our part to encourage and support our community in making necessary changes to make sure racism and disregard for the dignity of people of color become a part of our history and not our present. We vow to listen, learn, and work with others to promote equality, inclusion, and acceptance. The commission is committed to examining its rules to ensure that they address discriminatory conduct and to being a leader in moving the industry forward. Please help us better understand the experiences you have faced as a real estate broker or consumer around racism or other discrimination in your real estate transactions by contacting us and/or filing a complaint. We cannot stress enough the importance of providing us with this information. And I'm using that as a preview just to highlight the commission's position on that. I was attending a commission meeting yesterday, and one of the cases they discussed was a typical complaint that I'm going to talk about here. It was a situation where a broker used social media to make racist remarks and threatening remarks. and the commission is deciding what it wants to do with the case. I'm sure most of you, as soon as you got a license, your first thought was, I want to tell everybody that I know that I've got a license. You know, you started immediately promoting yourself through all the avenues that you had. And now with social media, most brokers are using that to promote themselves. And the thing you need to be aware of is that now that you've made it known to all of your friends and family that you're a real estate broker, every time you communicate through social media, you're doing it as a broker. And everyone who sees your post is going to filter what you say on social media through that lens of understanding that you're a broker. And so if you make a remark that contains hate speech or threats of violence based on race, everybody's going to say, well, that's a real estate broker making those remarks. And there's a good chance that someone in your sphere of influence is going to file a complaint. And this is the typical way that the commission is becoming aware of these situations, is that friends and family of brokers are reporting social media posts. And social media is not just Facebook, it's not just Twitter, it includes Nextdoor and other neighborhood groups, basically any kind of social media. And so you really need to be aware of what you're saying and how you're saying it on social media, because, you know, when we're having a conversation, you're able to see my body language and the tone that I'm using, and you can get a better understanding of what I mean when I say something. But on, you know, when you are sending emails and tweets and social media posts, people can't see your body language and your tone and always know what you're saying. And so it's very important to be careful with the words you choose. You know, and some tips for avoiding these kind of problems is, you know, always make sure you're conducting yourself in a professional manner. Just be aware that your audience is going to be diverse. You don't always know how they're going to interpret what you say, so make sure you're very careful about what you say. Your reputation, you've worked hard for it. It's your brand. It's how people are going to view you. You need to make sure that you protect that. You want to treat all brokers and clients and customers with courtesy and respect. You know, every transaction generally has some challenges. And that's why consumers need you as brokers, not only to guide them in making good decisions, but to help them navigate the challenges that they're going to face in every transaction. And the other issue with those challenges is that it brings a lot of emotions on. And, you know, you may be great at managing real estate transactions, sales and rentals, but the even harder challenge for you in a transaction is managing the people involved in the transaction. You know, it's easy to write an offer and present an offer and coordinate the inspections and all that, but managing the emotions and that go along with the consumers and the brokers that you deal with are challenging. And you've got to be really careful to do it in a way that's not going to inflame a situation. You know, if you're the kind of person where you have a short temper, or you get frustrated easily, or you use a lot of profanity in your communications, you really need to take a second look at yourself and how you communicate with others, because everything you say and the way you say it is going to make an impact, and it's going to make an impact for the better or for the worse. You know, in all of these situations, you're either going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. And, you know, if you think that your right to free speech is going to protect you in expressing your beliefs about race or anything along those lines, your right to free speech is only going to protect you to a certain point, because the real estate license law has a provision that enables the commission to take disciplinary action against a broker who engages in improper conduct. And if the commission views hate speech and racist remarks as improper conduct, it has the authority to pursue disciplinary action. Does anybody have a question about the commission's position or about issues that you're dealing with regarding race? Okay. And the other thing you need to be aware of is, you know, a lot of people may think or choose to think that racism is a thing of the past, that it was abolished back in the 60s with the Civil Rights Act. Unfortunately, that's not true. And, you know, as a white person, I haven't experienced racism the way persons of color have. And as white people, those of us who don't experience racism and discrimination need to be aware of that. I've got a case right now that was a complaint that was filed by a person of color, and her perception of the events are colored literally by her life experiences. You know, as a white person, if I encounter a real estate broker who is rude, my opinion might be, well, that's a rude broker. If I were a person of color and I interacted with a rude broker, my opinion might be, well, that's a rude broker, and that broker's rudeness might be based on my race. And so you need to be more aware of your interactions and how they can be interpreted by others. You know, of course, it's important not to be rude or disrespectful, but you also need to be aware of how, if you are rude and disrespectful to someone of color, then you may unknowingly be introducing race into your conversation, and it can affect your future interactions with that broker or that consumer. So just make sure that you're treating everybody with courtesy and respect, and treating them the same. The next topic I want to talk about is flipping. You know, we're seeing lots of late night commercials about flipping, getting rich quick, that kind of thing. Brokers are also getting involved as flippers themselves. A typical complaint that the commission gets these days is where a broker or the broker's seller client purchases and renovates a property. The broker then lists that property for sale, advertising it as fully renovated. A buyer comes along and enters into a contract to buy the property, then orders an inspection, and that inspection reveals defects. The buyer then terminates the contract. Well, it's typically the flipper, the seller, is not wanting to make repairs or spend any more money on the property. So the seller doesn't make any more repairs. The broker then puts the property back on the market. There are no disclosures that are made about the defects that buyer number one has discovered. Buyer number two comes along, enters into a contract, orders an inspection, finds the same exact defects that buyer number one discovered. And so buyer number two terminates. And so this process repeats itself sometimes 3 and 4 times. And, you know, it could be buyer number 2, number 3, and number 4 who files a complaint about this process, because certainly by the time buyer number 2 comes along, the listing agent knows about the defects with the property. You know, the commission might give the listing agent the benefit of the doubt regarding the first transaction where the listing agent may or may not have known about the defects. But certainly once buyer number 1 terminates and buyer number 2 comes along, the listing agent has got the information that's been furnished by the buyer number 1. So when you're dealing with a seller client that is in the business of flipping or renovating and reselling, you need to ask some very important questions. And those include, you know, exactly what renovations have been made. Make a list, find out how much money has been spent, which will lead you to the next question. You know, was a building permit required? There are some counties in North Carolina that basically have a dollar limit threshold where if the renovation amount exceeds that certain threshold, then a building permit will be required. And even if a seller doesn't disclose certain material facts or defects in the residential property and owners association disclosure statement, you as a listing agent must discover and disclose those facts. So you just need to make sure that even if you've got a long-standing relationship with a flipper or an investor, make sure that you are walking through and around the property to make sure that you do what you can to discover material facts so that you can disclose those to potential buyers. If you have received an inspection report from the seller or from, say, buyer number one, and if it contains material facts, material defects, then you have a duty to either share that report with potential buyers, future potential buyers, or to share the contents of that report. There are some listing agents that think that they don't have the authority to share inspection reports with potential buyers, but that's not true. If buyer number one shares his or her inspection report with you, then that report is no longer confidential, and you can share it with future buyers, assuming that buyer number one is terminated. If your seller client says, no, I don't want you to share that report with future buyers, you've still got to disclose the contents of that report with future buyers. So if buyer number two comes along and buyer number one's inspection report revealed a leaking roof or some other major defect, you've got to tell buyer number two or buyer number two's agent that the previous home inspection revealed a problem. And this is going to be true if you're selling your own property too. If you've gotten into the flipping business yourself, or if you're selling your own residence, you've got to make sure that you're disclosing material facts related to the property. Anybody got any questions about flipping? Okay. Well, if you do, let me know. I'm going to hang around after the presentation to answer any questions that you may not want to ask during the presentation. Material facts probably generate more complaints than any other topic that we have at the commission. Typical complaint is whether a buyer purchases a property and after closing discovers that important information was omitted or misrepresented. Keep in mind that while your local board of realtors probably has a 6-month statute of limitations on filing complaints, the Real Estate Commission does not have a limitation on that. We certainly prefer to get complaints as soon as possible, but it's not unusual for us to get a complaint from relating to a transaction that happened years ago. The perfect example is where someone buys a property, say 10 years ago, and they get ready to resell it now, and they discover that the septic permit for the property was specified 3 bedrooms, and there are 4 bedrooms in the house, and the current owner bought it thinking it was a 4-bedroom house. And so the misrepresentation that occurred 10 years ago may have just been discovered now. So the commission is going to just investigate that case just as if it happened yesterday. Tips for material facts. A material fact is going to be any information that could affect a reasonable person's decision to buy or sell. If you consider yourself a reasonable person, then in any situation where you are not sure about whether to disclose something, just ask yourself, if you were the buyer or if you were the seller, would you want to know? And obviously, if the answer is yes, then you need to disclose it. If you're ever sitting on the fence or not sure, we would strongly encourage you to err on the side of caution and disclose it. You may have a seller who doesn't want you to disclose something, but if it's a material fact, you don't have a choice. You've got to disclose it. And if you've got a client who doesn't want you to disclose a material fact, then that would be the red flag for you to sever ties with that particular client. You don't want to represent a client who doesn't want you to follow the license law and disclose material facts because it's going to get you in trouble. And the other thing is, it should also be a red flag as to what else your client knows but doesn't want to disclose to potential buyers. Agents for buyers and tenants also need to be careful to ask questions that would be of interest to your client. If you are representing a buyer or a tenant who has said, I don't want to rent or buy a property that has a septic system, or I've got respiratory problems and I don't want a property that has mold. You need to do your own due diligence to discover that information about properties that you are considering showing to your client, so that you can discover issues that your client is going to need to know to make decisions. Just to highlight, the commission wants you to understand that brokers are responsible for what they know or reasonably should know. So, if you need to go into every situation with your eyes and ears open, in other words, you need to approach every property as if you're the one who might want to buy it, or you're the one who might be selling it, and determine what's going to be a disclosable fact. We're going to briefly touch on some examples of material facts, that omissions. Proposed road projects are a typical example, and they're so easily discovered by looking at the DOT website or contacting your local planning department. Proposed subdivisions or commercial developments, zoning changes. If you're out driving around in your community and you see a zoning sign, proposed zoning change sign along the roadside, it would be a good idea for you to follow up on that and find out what's going on. Annexations are another important change because it could affect the taxing of a property that you're listing, or if you've got a buyer who has told you, I want to live in that neighborhood, or I want to live in that area, an annexation could certainly affect the tax rate for that area. We've had cases before where a buyer told the buyer agent, I don't want to pay city taxes, so make sure that you only show me properties that are subject to county taxes. That kind of buyer is something where that buyer has made it known up front that city taxes are a material fact for that buyer. HOA assessments and financial status are another issue. Some HOAs are in bad financial situations. If they've got a bunch of residents who are not paying their HOA dues, or if the HOA is responsible for making repairs and there is a large repair that's coming up and the HOA doesn't have the money to cover it, then you can assume that there's going to be an assessment coming. And that's a material fact that you need to disclose as a listing agent or discover as a buyer's agent. And then other things like proximity to airports and landfills and hog farms, underground storage tanks. If you're walking around a property and you see pipes sticking up out of the ground, you definitely need to ask questions. Is there still an underground fuel storage tank? If not, when it was removed, was the soil tested? Was the soil excavated? Those kind of questions. You really just need to know your listing, know your community, and know your client to protect yourself and your client. Other material facts that we see almost on a daily basis include square footage. You're not required to report square footage, but everybody does it because that is a metric that every seller is going to use in valuing the listing, and every buyer is going to use to determine whether the property is a good value, or determine whether a property is big enough to satisfy the buyer's needs. So just make sure if you're including square footage in your advertising, make sure that you are either measuring it and calculating it yourself or hire a professional to do it. Absolutely don't rely on tax records. Don't rely on something the seller has told you. Don't rely on a previous listing. Make sure you verify it. Bedrooms, the number of bedrooms always comes up in relation to septic systems. Make sure that every time you list a property with a septic system, you need to pull the septic permit and look at it. Even if a house has 4 bedrooms, if the septic system specifies 3 bedrooms, then that's how you have to advertise it, as 3 bedrooms. You can't say, well, in your ad, you can't advertise it as a 4-bedroom house and then put in the agent remarks that the septic permit specifies 3. You've got to limit your advertising to the number of bedrooms specified in the septic permit. If you're going to advertise city water and sewer, make sure you look at the utility bill or call the utility office to verify it and document who you spoke with if you call. I'm sure there's some neighborhoods in Jacksonville, just like they are in Raleigh and all over the state, where the houses initially had septic systems and wells, and the city came through and offered city water and sewer, and there were a handful of residents who chose not to spend the money to connect. And so there are still some houses out there that have wells and have septic systems, but yet they're surrounded by houses that are connected to city water. Don't get caught in the trap of assuming that just because other houses in a neighborhood have city water and sewer, that your new listing does. Make that one phone call, to verify. If it's only going to take one phone call to verify something, then the commission is going to expect you to do it. Title issues usually fall with closing attorneys, but if you're listing a property, it would definitely be a good idea to check the deed to find out who's named on the title, who's named on the deed. And if the person who's talking to you about listing the property is not named on the deed, then that should trigger a conversation. You need to find out if there's a power of attorney that's been issued that would give the person you're talking to the authority to list the property, especially if you're dealing with an estate or a divorce. The next item, if you've got a seller who says all repairs are complete, make sure you get documentation. You might have someone who has inherited a property from a parent or a grandparent, and the seller has gone in there and made repairs. Make sure you get those invoices so that you can share them with a potential buyer. And in all cases, just make sure you verify everything. If you're going to put in the MLS that the roof is new, or that the appliances are new, or the carpet is new, make sure you've got invoices to back it up. Because if the roof was installed 5 years ago, it's not new anymore. If the refrigerator was transferred from another property where it had been used for several years, it's not new anymore. And so you've got to be careful about how you refer to things as new or as renovated or as repaired to make sure you've got the documentation to back it up. Any questions about material facts? All right. Well, we will move on to unauthorized access. Typical complaint involves a buyer agent who gives a buyer keys or a lockbox combination prior to closing and without the seller's knowledge, and the buyer moves in prior to closing. Transaction doesn't close, sometimes either due to a title issue or loan denial. And then the seller is stuck with having to evict the buyer, who then damages the property while moving out. Another example from a property manager standpoint, property manager gives keys to a potential tenant to view a vacant property without being accompanied by the property manager. and that prospective tenant leaves a back door or a window unlocked for future entry. Both of these are just bad situations that are so preventable. Please do not ever give anybody access to a property that you don't own unless you have received the owner's express written authorization. You know, in sales transactions, you got the buyer possession before closing addendum. You know, you don't, there, to my knowledge, there's not a similar form in a tenant situation with a prospective tenant. But even if you get the owner's written authorization, it is still very risky to give someone authorization to go look at a property. You know, it's not uncommon for a buyer to say, you know, I want to show this property to my relatives. I want to go in and measure for curtains. You know, I think I want to renovate before I move in, and I want to have a carpet installer come and look at the property. Whatever the reason, make sure that you accompany the person to the house or to the property. Just don't give out a lockbox combination or a key. You know, you might have a buyer who says, you know, I've given notice in my apartment, I've got to move out before closing. I just want to move my stuff into the garage of the new house. Don't do that unless you get the owner's permission. It's just very, very risky. And it does happen on a regular basis. So, you know, I hope you never had this situation because it can really cause some problems for a seller. You know, the seller's homeowner's insurance typically doesn't cover a property, you know, for a rental situation. And so it can be really dicey for an owner if there's damage by someone other than the owner. Okay, personal property theft. These are typical scenarios that the commission sees. Scenario number one, a broker makes an appointment to show an occupied property. The broker visits the property alone and takes prescription medications. If you think that doesn't happen, I'm sad to report that it happens more than I'd care to admit. You know, we've had cases where, you know, and this is the typical scenario. But I had a case once where the seller scheduled a listing appointment with a broker. The broker came in and started the listing appointment and then excused herself to the bathroom. While in the bathroom, the broker went through all the medications in the seller's medicine cabinet, put some of the medications in her pocket, then came back out, finished her listing appointment with the seller, and then left. What the listing agent, potential listing agent, didn't know was that the seller had an obsessive compulsive disorder where the seller would routinely count her medication several times during the day. And so this seller had counted all of her prescription medications before the listing agent got there, and then again after the listing agent left. And so the seller knew exactly how many pills the listing agent had stolen. The seller called law enforcement, and the police were waiting for the listing agent when she got to her office. You know, that's just one of many examples. It is certainly more common these days for sellers to have video recording equipment in their houses. And so we have had several cases where sellers have sent us video recordings of brokers going through their cabinets and going through their medicine cabinets, not just looking at medications, but actually taking medications. Another situation we have seen before is where a buyer agent takes buyers into a property. The buyers split up. The broker can't follow both of the buyers, and one of the buyers ends up going to a medicine cabinet unsupervised and taking medications out. some tips for avoiding this. Just make sure that you advise every homeowner or tenant of an occupied property to secure and conceal all of their medications and firearms and cash and electronic devices. I had a case about a year ago where a broker had such a bad drug habit that he was going into listed properties and stealing not only prescription meds, but he was also taking cash and collections. And one seller had a collection of shark teeth displayed out on a table, and the broker actually took several of the shark teeth from that seller's collection. The seller reported it to the police, who went to the broker's office, and the broker just had an office full of stuff that he had stolen from listed properties around town. So definitely make sure that your listing presentation or your listing appointment includes advice to a seller to secure, preferably by a lock, everything of value, especially prescription medications. Concealing by itself is not going to be sufficient because I've had complaints where the seller said they thought they had hidden their medications well enough that no one could find them, and yet a broker did find them. So hiding medications may not be enough. The other thing is, if you're showing property to more than one person, make sure you keep everybody together. That's just the safest way for you, and the safest way for the property is to keep everybody together. The only way this real estate business works is if consumers trust real estate brokers when brokers come into their properties. And a seller should be able to believe that a real estate broker is not going to cause harm or damage or theft to a property. And so, it's your job when you're inside a property that you don't own to make sure that you're doing everything you reasonably can to safeguard that property. Homeowners are allowed, or I should say property owners are allowed to use video recording devices in areas where privacy is not expected. They cannot use audio recording devices, but they can use video recording devices. And that probably, the exception to that is probably doorbell cameras. There is not going to be an expectation of privacy with a doorbell camera. So just make sure that when you approach somebody's property, if they've got a doorbell camera, they may be watching and listening to what you're doing and saying. So just keep that in mind. Don't discuss an offer on somebody's front porch if they've got a doorbell camera. Anybody got questions about any of that?
There was a question, and I may have missed it before. It goes back to material fact. The question is the fact that a house flooded in Florence, even though it's not in a special flood hazard area, a material fact?
The fact that a property flooded once during a hurricane itself is not a material fact. However, if that flooding caused damage that hasn't been repaired by a professional, then yes, the damage itself is material, not the previous flooding event. And the other thing, I'm glad you brought that up, because flood maps are updated periodically. And so one thing you want to do when you're listing a property, especially if it is ever flooded, make sure you're looking at the flood map to see if the property is now in a flood zone when maybe it wasn't in a flood zone before. So the fact that a property is in a flood zone is a material fact. The fact that there was previous damage that hasn't been repaired is a material fact. But if it was, if there was one flooding event, one time at some point in the past, that would not be considered material, because you're going to have hurricanes pretty much anywhere in the state. And, you know, the fact that something happened once, the fact that a house was struck by lightning once, you know, the fact that a house had a fire once, as long as all the repairs were made and there's no lingering damage, you don't have to worry about disclosing it. Offer and acceptance generates a lot of telephone calls and some complaints. A typical complaint is where buyer number one makes an offer. His agent sends it to the listing agent. They have a conversation, and then afterward, the buyer agent says, we have a deal. Later, the listing agent informs the buyer agent that another offer has come in and that the seller has accepted the offer from buyer number two. And what typically happens is that buyer number one files a complaint against the listing agent saying that the listing agent lied about the seller's acceptance of his offer. And that may or may not be true. The listing agent may or may not have misrepresented the seller's response to the offer. And the buyer agent may have failed to educate the buyer number one about the whole process of offer and acceptance. And it's not uncommon when we get a complaint filed by a buyer against a listing agent, it's not uncommon for us to add the buyer's agent as a respondent in the case. As a respondent is a broker who becomes part of the investigation because clearly all of the communications between a buyer and a listing agent have to flow through the buyer agent. And if the buyer agent is not correctly communicating with the buyer, then the commission might caution that buyer agent. So some things you need to understand is that the statute of fraud says that a contract for the sale of real property requires a written agreement that's signed by all parties and communicated by all parties. An oral offer or an oral agreement cannot become a binding contract. So don't ever use the word, verbally accepted, because it doesn't mean anything. If you have a seller that says, I'm willing to accept that, you still don't have a contract. You've got a seller who has expressed a willingness to accept, but that's not the same as acceptance. The commission has a really good Q&A brochure on offer and acceptance. I would strongly urge you to share that with all of your buyers and sellers because I think it will help you educate them. The key thing to understand is that if you submit an offer and a listing agent says the seller has accepted the offer, the first question that you should ask as a buyer agent is, has the seller signed the offer? If the answer is yes, then you can tell your buyer client, okay, now we have a contract or we have a deal. If you ask the question to the listing agent, has the seller signed the offer? And the listing agent says no, or says, oh, I'm not sure, then you don't have a contract yet. And all you got is a seller who may have expressed a willingness to accept the offer, but there is no contract. And you've got to make sure that you don't tell your buyer client that you've got a contract, that the buyer has a contract until the seller actually signs it and communicates that fact back to you. And until the seller actually signs an offer and communicates that to the buyer or the buyer agent, the seller is free to consider other offers and accept another offer. And, it's really important that you don't get so eager to tell a buyer that there's a contract that has been formed that you mislead that buyer into thinking that the buyer's offer has actually become a contract, because it may not. Because even if the seller says, I'm willing to accept that offer, until the seller actually signs it and communicates that fact back to the buyer or the buyer's agent, there is no contract. And as I said, we get complaints about that all the time. I would certainly welcome any questions you have about offer and acceptance.
We did have one in the chat.
Okay.
A backup offer, how do you handle due diligence money when the backup goes primary upon notification? Has two contracts recently where they did not deliver DD money but terminated within 2 days.
Okay, well, we're going to get that to a minute in a minute in the where's the money section. But backup offers have to be presented just like regular offers, and they should be accompanied by due diligence money that's payable to the seller, so that if the seller accepts the backup offer, the due diligence money can be deposited by the seller. But just hold that thought for just a minute, because I'm getting ready to cover that very topic. Under where's the money? A typical complaint is where a seller enters into a contract to sell their property. The contract specifies the buyers to pay $1,000 due diligence fee and $2,000 earnest money. 3 days later, the buyers terminate the contract without having paid the due diligence fee or the earnest money, and the buyer stops communicating with the buyer agent. Another example is where a tenant signs a lease and promises to pay the security deposit when the tenant gets paid next Friday, and the tenant moves in and never pays the security deposit. As far as the due diligence fee goes, Section 1 of the standard offer to purchase contract form indicates that the due diligence fee will be delivered to the seller by the effective date. And of course, everybody should know the effective date is the date on which the last person signs the offer. So the effective date is the effective date of the contract. So if you're working with a buyer and you write an offer this morning and you submit it to the listing agent, when is the buyer hoping to hear from the listing agent that the seller has accepted the offer? Like as soon as possible, right? So if the buyer and the buyer agent are hoping to hear as soon as possible that the offer has been accepted, and if they're hoping to hear today, that means today is going to be the effective date of the contract. And if today is the effective date, then pursuant to the terms of the contract, today is the day that the due diligence fee needs to be delivered to the seller. And so as a best practice recommendation, a buyer agent should collect the due diligence fee with the offer and deliver it with the offer so that it can be deposited today or at least received by the seller today if the offer is accepted today. Listing agents should discourage a seller from accepting an offer before actually receiving the due diligence fee check. So at least the listing agent should have the check in hand and be able to tell the seller, okay, I have the due diligence fee check before the seller signs, because otherwise you're running the risk of just what happened in that question that was raised, is that there are buyers who are using this as a strategy. They're making offers without ever intending to submit a due diligence fee check or an earnest money check, and they're hoping to get far enough along in the transaction where they can terminate it without ever paying any money. And the only way you can really protect your clients, if your client's a seller, is to collect the checks up front. And if you're a buyer agent, you need to make sure that you are educating your buyer client as to what's expected. You know, when you as a buyer client review that offer with the buyer before asking the buyer to sign it, you need to say, look, this offer says you're going to pay the due diligence fee on the effective date. And if you're hoping the seller is going to accept this offer today, then you need to get me that check today. A picture of a check is not going to cut it. A picture of a check, only means that the buyer has written a check. It doesn't mean that the agent has the check. It doesn't mean that the listing agent has the check. It doesn't really mean anything that is really going to help. Earnest money is a similar situation. The standard form contract, section 1D, basically has two boxes in it. And for the earnest money, they indicate that the buyer is either going to pay the earnest money with the offer or is going to pay the earnest money within 5 days of the effective date. If you're writing an offer, you need to check one of those boxes. please do not submit an offer without having checked one of those boxes. Otherwise, the seller is not going to have any idea when the earnest money is going to be paid. If you're a listing agent, make sure you review the offer before you send it to the seller. And part of your review should include checking to see if one of those two boxes is checked. If not, if one box is not checked, you need to get it checked, because that's very important. Because if neither box is checked, you have no idea when the buyer is planning to pay the earnest money, if at all. And just, you know, as a best practice, don't ever allow your clients to sign any offer if it's got empty spaces or boxes that aren't checked. It's just real important as far as protecting their interest to make sure that everything is complete before it's signed. Also keep in mind, a lot of firms, real estate firms these days, don't have trust accounts. If your firm is one of those, and if you are the listing firm and you don't have a trust account and you're depending on the buyer agent's firm or the closing attorney to take care of the earnest money check, you need to make sure that you follow up with either the buyer agent's firm or the closing attorney's office to make sure they've actually received the earnest money. Don't just assume that the money's been collected, because that's another source of complaints where a buyer terminates a contract, has never paid the earnest money, and the broker's never followed up to verify it. So just make sure that if the buyer agent's firm is holding the earnest, is supposed to hold the earnest money, or the closing attorney is supposed to hold it, make sure you follow up. Don't make an assumption. Also, if something happens and the buyer terminates the contract without paying the due diligence fee, the due diligence fee is still owed by the buyer, because it's a non-refundable fee that the buyer agrees to pay. It's not non-refundable. So even if a buyer walks away, the buyer still owes it. Now, realistically, trying to collect that fee from a buyer who walks away is going to be difficult, especially if the buyer doesn't live locally, but the money is still owed. And then getting back to the property manager situation where the tenant has paid, the tenant has promised to pay the security deposit at some point in the future. That's not a good way to protect the landlord. So just make sure that if you're a property manager, you're collecting all the monies that the landlord is expecting you to collect, because the landlord is certainly not going to want you to allow a tenant to move in if the landlord is expecting the security deposit to be collected. Anybody got questions about security deposits, earnest money, or due diligence fees? Alrighty. Inspections. Typical complaint is where a buyer orders an inspection and then asks the seller to hire a specialist to inspect some aspect of the property. It might be the HVAC system, maybe the structure, maybe the roof. And then after closing, the buyer discovers that defects were worse than the seller's inspector indicated, or that repairs that the seller agreed to make were not made or were poorly made. Of course, as you likely know, the standard offer to purchase and contract doesn't require sellers to make repairs. And if a buyer wants a seller to make repairs, there really needs to be a written agreement. I hope all of you are using the due diligence request and agreement form, because to create an agreement yourself would be considered the unauthorized practice of law and would not be allowed. So when you're using the DDRA, it's very important that you understand that it be prepared by a broker. We've had some cases in the past where a buyer agent's closing coordinator prepared the DDRA and the closing coordinator was not licensed. And since it's an agreement that would be signed by both the buyer and the seller, it's not allowed for an unlicensed person to prepare that agreement. So just make sure that if you are working in a team environment, make sure that a broker member of your team is assisting the buyer in reviewing the home inspection report and preparing the DDRA. Wording of that DDRA should be very specific regarding the repairs and the services that the buyer wants to be performed and how they're going to be performed, and specify who's going to prepare them. So many agents assume that that form requires the seller to hire licensed professionals to make the repairs. It does not. The standard form, DDRA, does not say anything about licensed professionals. So if you want to advocate for your client, and if your client wants the work to be done by licensed professionals, then you need to specify that in the DDRA when you prepare it. Additional tips. If a home inspector recommends further inspections by a specialist, we strongly recommend that you advise your buyer client to order these inspections himself or herself. Inspections ordered by a seller may favor the seller and may not give the full extent of the problem. And so if the buyer hires the inspectors, then the seller would make the repairs, and then the buyer should then have his own inspector go back and make a second inspection of the repairs to make sure they've been completed properly. The commission has two brochures, one on home inspections that goes into detail about home inspections, but we've also got a fairly new brochure, a Q&A brochure on due diligence for residential buyers. If you haven't looked at that, I would strongly encourage you to do so. It will walk you, a buyer agent, through the due diligence process, and it includes a lot more than just inspections. But I think you'll find it very helpful, and it will help you educate your buyer clients. It will also help educate sellers as well as to what to expect. But it's a great brochure that's now available through the commission's website. You can also order the hard stock version, but the PDF version on the commission's website is certainly adequate. Typical issues with landlords and tenants. With tenants, it's common for tenants to say the property wasn't ready for occupancy on the move-in date. Property manager did not respond or was slow to respond to requests for repairs. Property manager did not refund the security deposit within 30 days. And the property manager made improper deductions to the security deposit or didn't provide receipts for the deductions. These are definitely the most common complaints that we get from tenants. And I just want to offer some reminders. If you're managing a rental property, it's really important that you take a look at that rental property before the effective date of a lease, especially if the property's been vacant for a while, or maybe the property was hit by a hurricane last season and nobody's been in it nobody's occupied it since the repairs were done. Always go take a look at a property before a tenant moves in. Even if you're sending an unlicensed employee over there, make sure it really is ready for occupancy, because that is a huge letdown for tenants when they arrive at a property with their U-Haul loaded down and they're ready to move in, and the property needs to be cleaned or it needs to be renovated somehow, or if you've got some kind of agreement with a tenant where you've agreed to make certain repairs prior to the tenant moving in, make sure you get those done, because if you don't, it's likely going to lead to a complaint. One thing I do want to point out is, back during the recession that we had 10 years ago, a lot of residential brokers, sales brokers transitioned into the property management business and hired unlicensed people to assist. And a lot of existing property management firms grew and added unlicensed people to assist with managing properties. Just be aware that the general statutes have a very limited list of duties that an unlicensed person can do when assisting a broker in managing properties. And that list of duties does not include determining the disposition of a security deposit. So, you know, as brokers managing properties for others, you need to make sure that you are making the decision, you or someone who's licensed are making the decision regarding security deposit deductions, and also overseeing and making sure that those security deposits are being refunded within 30 days. It's very, very important. And making sure that there are no deductions for anything other than actual damages. Landlord complaints usually include they want to make sure the property managers are screening tenants. It's not uncommon for a landlord to file a complaint and find out that there was no background check done, or that the tenant you know, moved out of his last apartment owing rent, and the new property manager decided to rent to that tenant anyway. Landlords frequently complain about their property managers not inspecting their properties very often, or not notifying the landlord about issues such as unpaid rent or notice of termination. And the property manager making deductions to rent payments, rent proceeds, that sort of thing. A lot of the complaints that come from property managers about, a lot of the complaints that come from owners about property managers deal with communications. And that's really a simple fix. You know, you've got to keep your clients informed. When you're advertising a new property and you get applications, it's very important to do a background check on each tenant, and you need to be consistent. You can't say, oh, that potential tenant looks like an honest person with a good job and drives a nice car. I'm not going to spend the money on a background check. You can't do that. You got to have the same policy and procedure for every potential tenant and treat every potential tenant the same. If you don't allow tenants with certain criminal convictions, that's got to be applied equally across the board. You know, so you just have to be consistent. I would strongly encourage you to inspect every rental property at the beginning and end of every lease. If you've got a lease that's going to renew after the first year, I would strongly encourage you to go in and do an inspection, because that will help you discover lease violations such as, you know, unauthorized pets and unauthorized tenants. It will also help you discover damages to the property, or if the tenant's supposed to be maintaining the yard, it'll help you discover if the tenant's not doing those things. Another big issue that we complaint that we get from landlords is not getting the rent on time every month. Most property management agreements don't actually specify when the property manager is going to send the rent proceeds every month. And so if you're a property manager, I would strongly encourage you to decide, you know, and I'm sure you've already got a date in your policy, you know, whether it's the 15th or the 20th or whatever you decide, your policies and procedures include some sort of date every month by which you're going to send out the rent. And you need to discuss that with the property owner and put that date in your property management agreement, so that, you know, so that you're managing the expectations of the owner. So, because it certainly is unreasonable for an owner to expect you to send the rent proceeds by the 5th day of every month, or even by the 10th day of every month. And so you need to manage those owners' expectations by having that conversation and by putting it in your property management agreement. Wire fraud is our last topic of the day. It doesn't account for that many complaints, but its impact on victims is huge. And it can prevent someone from being able to buy a property. I've had cases where the losses range from $75,000 up to $300,000. And so the impact is really huge. And so you need to be on your guard when receiving emails and phone calls from people who are trying to talk to you about transferring money by wire. And what typically happens is that the hacker hacks into a closing attorney's computer and identifies transactions where a buyer has to bring large sums of money to closing. And if the hacker is unable to get the buyer's contact information from the closing attorney's computer, then the hacker will send the buyer agent an email saying, and will pose as the closing attorney and say, we're getting close to closing. The buyer is going to need to send X amount of money so that we can close. Please give me the buyer's email address. And if the buyer agent gives the hacker the email address for the buyer, then the hacker is going to send an email to the buyer saying, oh, we've had a change in the wiring instructions, and these are the new wiring instructions. And the buyer doesn't know any better and then just sends the money to the fraudulent wiring instructions from the hacker. These hackers are so smooth and they're so sophisticated and they're so clever that unless you're really paying attention, it can happen to literally anybody. And so to avoid this, just make sure you instruct your clients to contact the closing attorney or whoever they're supposed to send their money to by wire transfer, and verify with a phone call what the correct wiring instructions are. Make sure you tell your client never to respond to an email from someone they haven't verified. The other thing you need to be aware of, and that I discovered in one of my investigations, is that when you get an email on your smartphone or on your tablet, the sender's name is going to pop up on your smartphone, but the sender's email address may not be visible. And so if you assume that the person you're getting that email from is the person whose name you see, you might be fooled, because hackers will create an email address that's very similar to that of the closing attorney and will use the closing attorney's name in the email, and you can be easily fooled. So just make sure that you don't get tricked that way, and make sure that if you start getting an email from someone asking about wiring funds and that kind of thing, make sure you direct the buyer or your client to contact the closing attorney directly, because that direct communication with the closing attorney is the only way you're going to be able to guard against being taken advantage of and losing a lot of money. Most complaints that we get could have been avoided with better communication with your client or with an apology. Sometimes I'm on phone duty and I'll spend 10 or 15 minutes listening to a consumer complain about a broker. And, at the end of the conversation, I'll say to the consumer, well, you're welcome to file a complaint. And sometimes the consumer will say, well, I don't want to get the broker in trouble. I just wanted an apology. And so just keep that in mind, that even when you cause a problem unintentionally, or even intentionally, sometimes all the consumer is really looking for is your apology. So, you know, and if you do cause a problem that costs your client some money, and if you pay money to that client, the commission is going to favorably consider that. So let's say you tell your client that the refrigerator in the house is new, and it turns out it's not, and you end up having to buy your client a new refrigerator. And let's say it costs $1,000. You know, if you pay, let's say the buyer files a complaint, and then after you get the complaint, you pay the buyer $1,000. The commission is going to favorably consider that. What I mean by that is that we're going to take that into consideration. It's not going to cause us to automatically close our file, but we'll certainly consider what you've done to resolve the dispute in a manner that's satisfactory to the consumer. So sometimes we get calls from brokers that we've written to, and they'll say, you know, I got your letter about the complaint. I'm willing to pay this consumer for the new refrigerator. You know, what does that mean? I still have to respond to the letter of inquiry? The answer is yes. They still have to respond, but we're going to favorably consider whatever the broker is willing to do to fix the problem. So that's pretty much the end of the presentation. I'm curious if you have any questions about any of the topics or about complaints or what you're supposed to do if you get a letter of inquiry.
If you guys have questions, you can unmute and ask, or if you want to, you can put them in the chat.
I think everybody's hungry.
That could be.
Or asleep.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for being here today and sharing all of this wonderful information with us. I hope everybody learned a little something today. And if y'all have questions, you know, again, chime in. Okay.
Thank you for being here and answering all those questions or going through all the material. It was very helpful.
And we want to see Dee.
All right, Dee.
Show yourself, Dee. We miss you.
Where is Dee? She may be answering a phone call.
I was going to say she was just on here a minute ago.
She may still be on mute to answer a phone call or something.
It's all right. It's all right.
But we're very grateful to have her. She's doing a great job.
All right, everybody. So this last portion of the program is going to be an information session with Ms. Stephanie Walker, outlining the changes of the Code of Ethics, adding the Standard of Practice 10.5. Please keep all of your questions relevant and respectful. And should you have any concerns or comments that you would like for the National Association to have, I will put the email address for the professional standards at NAR in the chat box. So you can click on that and send your concerns to them. Stephanie is just here to kind of fill us in on those changes. So Stephanie has been in the real estate business on the Outer Banks for more than 3 decades. In addition to being the broker owner of Stephanie Walker and Associates, she continues to serve the local, state, and national associations. On the National Association of Realtors, she has twice been appointed to serve on the expanded leadership team and the executive committee as a liaison to the president. And she has served as the chair of the Professional Standards Committee and the Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board. She continues to serve on those committees as well as the NAR Board of Directors. Stephanie, take it away.
Hey, well, thank you guys for being here. Thanks for caring enough to spend part of your day trying to figure this stuff out. It's not hard. So I'm just going to go through all of the changes that happen. And so November 13th, 2020 is a new day in realtor world. And I will tell you that there were a lot of changes were made that day. The board of directors meeting went about 4 hours, with half of it working just on these issues. And so on that day, we got some new rules. And I'm going to just run through them pretty quickly. We had a change to policy statement 29. So we'll talk about that. New standard of practice under Article 10, which we always refer to as our fair housing article. There is a new definition of the public trust. So it's more clear than it ever was. And the focus on it's pretty darn narrow now. And then we made some changes to how we do things. And we have some new sanctioning guideline updates to sort of help panels if they actually need to apply some sanctions for an Article 10 violation based on this new stuff. And then a little membership qualification criteria as well, just a little tweak into that. But the time for the implementation is right now. It was actually on November 13th. If anybody's superstitious, that was a Friday the 13th. But anyway, typically when we make these sort of changes to the Code of Ethics, they take effect the following January 1st. NAR felt like this was such an issue, and that hate speech was being so prevalent really on social media more than anywhere else, that we needed to do it now. And so all these changes took effect as soon as the board of directors voted them through. And really what it boils down to is hate speech. We will not post any hate speech or spew any hate speech against any of the protected classes under Article 10 of the Code of Ethics. We also have a new policy statement. The policy statement says, and I think this is the one that people are pretty whooped up over right now. It says a realtor shall be subject to disciplinary action under the Code of Ethics with respect to all of their activities. And that's the stuff in the big print, okay? With respect to all of their activities. The Code of Ethics, realtors used to be subject to disciplinary action under the code when it was a real estate related activity or they were in the middle of a transaction. And so now it's all the time. So people don't get to say, I wasn't participating in a real estate activity and I was not in the middle of a transaction. And so when I posted that on my Facebook page, you can't do anything about it. Well, actually, now they can. And so there's some people that are really unhappy with probably more so the policy change than the actual standard of practice that was added, which I'll also cover. So Article 10, this is what Article 10 has always said. We did not change the article. Okay, so when we raised our right hand and became a realtor and said that we would always abide by the Code of Ethics, this was just the same. Okay, and it said that we would not deny equal professional services to the protected classes, that we would not be a party to discriminate against the protected classes, and that we would not discriminate against the protected classes in our employment practices. Okay, so that did not change. The article remains the same. And our protected classes are right there on the screen for you: race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, national origin, and then the realtors have two additional ones to the federal law, and that's sexual orientation and gender identity. So from realtors, these are our protected classes. Let's see. And this is the new standard of practice that was added. And the standard of practice says realtors must not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on the protected classes. And they're spelled out. So that is the new standard of practice under Article 10. So let's talk about what those individual things are. So when we look at harassment, harassment includes, and we're taking this harassment language actually from NAR's harassment policy. And so this refers to that policy. It includes inappropriate conduct, comment, display, action, gesture, some gestures, and then the protected classes that are listed under Article 10. So it's a little bit more broad. We probably don't have to spend a lot of time on harassment. Everybody knows what harassment is, right? I mean, I'm happy to take any questions as we're going through it or when we're done. Hate speech. So that's speech that's intended to insult, offend, or intimidate a person because of some trait. Those words come right from the dictionary. I've talked about this a lot since it happened. And a lot of people say, well, how in the world do you define hate speech? Well, that's it. It's actually in the dictionary. This one actually came from Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And so there is an actual definition of hate speech. And for realtor purposes, this is the one that they chose. So hate speech is pretty easily defined. An epithet. An epithet is a characterizing word or phrase that's usually disparaging or abusive. And I think we probably all in our heads can go, oh, I know some of those, right? We all do. We've all heard them. And then a slur. So slurs are typically language that is shaming or degrading or discouraging. So for me, it's pretty easy to wrap the bundle, right? It's things that no one wants anybody to say to them. And it's just saying, okay, we're not going to stand for this anymore. We've got to be better. We've always held ourselves to a higher standard, and we have upped the bar. And the one thing that I hear, and we all hear over and over and over, is how do we increase professionalism? How do we make our industry more professional? And so this is likely a step in the right direction. So a violation of Article 10, as supported by Standard of Practice 10.5, can occur when a realtor uses any of those things. So hate speech, epithets, slurs, or some sort of harassing speech. And now it doesn't matter if we are talking about a real estate related activity or transaction. It applies across the board because of the change to policy statement 29. And prior to this, most people would have gone, policy statement what? Where do I find that? I've never seen that. And it was the big, it's the one that said that there was a very specific instance where this stuff would apply. Now it applies all the time. So here's, I don't think this is going to be easy to do. I think, again, it's going to be, there's a lot of stuff that the hearing panel is going to need to do to find someone in violation based on these changes. They're going to have to look and see whether the hate speech, epithet, slur was based on the protected classes. So first of all, was it harassing speech or hate speech or epithet or slur? So it's got to be one of those four. And then once you've determined that it's one of those four, was it against one of the protected classes? Now, I can argue a point that every single one of us is a protected class. And so really what you're going to have to do is figure out, was it one of those four things? And then was it against the protected class? Was it against some protected characteristic that this happened? And so I've got a few examples. I will let you guys decide whether or not you think they would be a violation or not, or whether it would rise to that level. Some of them are political. Some may say they're all political, but these are some of the ones that we looked at and some of the ones that were considered when we were having the discussions on all of this. So I'm going to apologize if any of these offend anybody. I didn't make them up. these were truly some of the ones that we talked about at the Interpretations and Procedures Subcommittee when we were working on this issue. So here's the first one. I think most people would say that this was a political statement. Now, is it in bad taste? You can decide that. I would probably say, yeah, it's in a really bad taste. But does that rise to the level of hate speech? Is it harassment? Is it an epithet? Is it a slur? I don't know. It was 6 weeks before the election, 8 weeks before the election, something like that. So a panel would have to make that decision. Okay, here's another one. People find this one incredibly offensive, and this is another one that we looked at. So I'll give you a second to look at that. And unfortunately, these were all posted on Realtor pages. So I don't know. They take a lot of thought. And then again, you got to go back to, do they rise to the level of those 4 things? And is it, harassment, hate speech, epithet, or slur? So even though something might be offensive, there is a bar that the panels are going to have to reach in order to find a violation. And then there's this one. This one had been around for a long time. I don't know how many times I'd seen it on Facebook. But I think that when people post this stuff on Facebook, I don't know, I'm a grandkid fish person on Facebook. I'm gonna post grandkids, I'll post pictures of fish. I probably do something on Santa Claus. I did the other day. Santa was in my neighborhood on the fire truck. But most people would not post stuff like this. But I think what people do, it's a political statement, probably not a racial statement or a statement against any of our protected classes. But again, a panel, they're going to have that bar they're going to have to reach to get through this. And this one's just to add a little levity to the situation. Don't go to Facebook jail. I post this one for my husband every now and then when he posts something that I don't think he should. So he's retired. Apparently he can post whatever he wants. Okay. And then we have the new public trust. And I'll point out the differences here. So the very first one is misappropriation of client or customer funds or property. That did not change. Okay, that's exactly the same that it's been for years. The second one is discrimination. And now it's very specific. It's discrimination. It used to say willful discrimination. They took the willful out. So if someone inadvertently discriminates against someone, it's going to rise to this level of, potentially a violation of the public trust. And then the fraud used to say that it was fraud was substantial economic harm. And they took away the economic harm. So actually, there's a lot less words to remember now for a violation of the public trust. But what the point of changing this is that if there were a violation of Article 10, Fair Housing Article, then that would be a violation of the public trust, whether somebody made a mistake or whether they meant to do it. And the thing about violations of the public trust is these are sent to the licensing authorities. So for us, North Carolina Real Estate Commission. So we don't have to get through these exercises, but what I want to point out is that discrimination isn't always obvious, right? sometimes, and sometimes when people discriminate, they don't even realize that they're doing it. And everybody has biases. And most of the time we have biases that are really deep within us that we don't even realize that we have. So there's lots of exercises that we can go through to figure that out. You know, there's NAR has also produced a new program called Fairhaven. So if you haven't been through Fairhaven, it's going to take about 60 to 90 minutes. It's Fairhaven.realtor, I think. Jamie, do you know? I can't remember now. Or is
It
yeah,
is. We shared it this morning. I'm getting ready to post it again.
Okay, Fairhaven.realtor. It's a really interesting program about discrimination and how it can happen and how it can happen inadvertently. And it gives you the opportunity to work through some transactions. You have to sell 4 houses to get out of Fairhaven. But it also puts you in the situation where you might be the client, and some things that someone may say to you or something that you might expect. It just really brings a lot of this to the front, you know, to top of mind. So hopefully we'll be a little more aware, because there you may figure out something in Fairhaven that you do that you never really thought about before. So an interesting program to run through for sure. And then steering, and there's a couple steering instances, but steering a lot of times is done unintentionally. And I guess most of you heard your first speaker this morning. Yeah, and I'm sorry I couldn't join in on that, and I look forward to hearing about it. But there's actually a case that was just forwarded in North Carolina about steering, where they said, you know, they told their client, and I don't know what the makeup of the client was, but they said, you know, no, that's not where you want to be. You want to be over here. And the client said, no, I want to be there. And they went, no, that's not your type of neighborhood. And it's probably going to move forward and move through our process. So even if it's unconscious or you didn't intend to do it, it's still illegal. Okay. And fair housing violations are really, really serious. The penalties are really serious. For each instance, you can have a penalty of $25,000 to $50,000. And that's just the fine. The judges can also award punitive damages, and there's no limit on what the punitive damages are. People can sue you, so it might not be just your HUD office or the Department of Justice at the federal or state level. Individuals can file those suits as well. And the Attorney General in your state can also file a civil lawsuit in federal court. And those penalties are $50,000 to $100,000. So this stuff is super serious. And I'm pretty sure that if you get to this point, you're probably going to be talking to the North Carolina Real Estate Commission too. So you can be held liable for your agents if you are brokers in charge. You can get in just as much trouble for perhaps not supervising them or not looking at what they're doing or not training them on fair housing. Okay, so just make sure that you know what's going on out there, especially on their social media sites, because that's where I think a lot of people are going to get tripped up. So who has oversight over fair housing? Everybody. The federal government, the state government, the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, and the Code of Ethics. Okay, so the realtors, the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, the state, and the federal governments. So there's a lot of it out there. A lot of enforcement, as you probably already heard this morning. So here's some resources. You have NAR's website, absolutely chock full of information. There's so much of it there. Realtor Magazine has had a bunch of fair housing stuff all for years. absolutely. The Newsday report, which you guys heard about this morning. North Carolina Realtors has a fair housing section on their website as well. And then there's the Fairhaven, which is on the NAR site. So a fair housing simulation. And that's really pretty cool. And again, it doesn't take you very long. And it's kind of, it's almost like playing a game. It's really fun. And then North Carolina Realtors in October, so really even before all of this stuff happened, North Carolina Realtors Board of Directors approved a diversity and inclusion statement. So if you haven't seen that, it's right there on the screen and you're welcome to screenshot it, or I think Heather's going to have it on video. So, but it basically says we are North Carolina Realtors and there is no room for discrimination in North Carolina. So I know they're really proud to have gotten that through. It was a unanimous vote and that happened in October. So what kind of questions do you have? Anybody? But if you're going to ask a question, you have to turn your video on because I don't talk to people that I can't see.
You guys don't have any questions?
I posted one for you, Stephanie.
Oh, you did? Well, of course. that's just your haul.
How do I get in on that?
No, we have 8 grandkids, so there's a lot going on at Christmas time.
That's fun. I get to see mine tomorrow.
Are you? How and where is she?
Charlotte.
Charlotte. Okay.
Okay, I've got questions.
Okay.
Okay, so let's clear up some rumors.
Is that your staircase? What is that?
Girl, no, it's
oh, it's a chair. Okay.
Not a front ceiling. Who knows? Will you address the free speech argument with regards to this new article, please?
Yes, I will. So, that goes back to policy statement 29. It doesn't have much to do actually with this article. Okay, it has to do with the policy statement. And free speech is talked about in the Constitution, and what it says is that no government entity can deny you the right to free speech. NAR is a trade organization. It is not a government entity, and they can make that a condition of your membership. Okay. So they can tell you what you can and cannot say and what kind of behavior you're expected to exhibit, because they are not a government authority.
Okay.
Next, is that sufficient?
Yeah, okay. Just kind of laying it out there for everybody. Let's just make sure everybody in the back hears, okay? Next thing, the other discussion that I think that probably should be had is, what are a realtor's options if they do not agree with this and they think that it's not fair or whatever?
Okay, so this is going to sound really cold, but the option is you don't have to be a member of the National Association of Realtors. You don't have to be a realtor. There's lots of people out there that aren't. Now, I'm not going to go into the why you want to be a realtor or why that maybe isn't a good idea. But what I would do if I really have issues with this, I would reach out to NAR. And they're going to provide, email at professionalstandards@nar.realtor. They're going to provide people to look at those. I feel like most of those we will look at Interps. I'm sure. So this year they had about 90 people complain about discriminatory speech or hate speech or harassing speech. That was, you probably had to go the last 20 or 25 or 30 years to have that many complaints about something like that. Almost all of them happened after the end of May. People were upset that realtors were doing this. So what does that say? Let's find the preamble. Yeah. Christina, did you post that?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
Jamie did.
Jamie did. Okay. So it says in the preamble, which is not violating the preamble is not an enforceable action, but it is also one of the things that when we raise our hand, we agreed to abide by. And it says that we will take steps to eliminate practices that damage the public. Right. And so this is kind of what they're talking about. But if you have a problem with it, reach out to NAR and don't just holler about it. You know, tell them exactly why you don't agree. And if it's is it that I don't agree with the new standard of practice under 10-5, or I don't agree with the policy statement, because they are different. And when people call me and talk about it, what I'm really finding is that they're much more upset about the policy statement than they are about the standard of practice. Because really nobody thinks that you should be using that kind of speech anywhere. Right? No one's really disagreeing with that. I think it's more of, you don't have the right to tell me what I can and can't say. But the truth is they do.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I've ran across realtors, I've ran across realtors who have decided to not renew their membership and just be agents because of the new rule that says that realtors have to give lockbox access to licensees.
Well, those rules aren't done yet. Yeah,
not yet, but there's enough people that feel confident and optimistic enough that they're ready to not renew their dues this year. It's interesting. It's interesting that some people are willing to dig their heels in on this topic. And I hate that they feel discriminated against, or that their speech is being inhibited, but you agree to be a dues paying member of an organization, and the organization makes the rules that you agree to follow or not.
Yeah, the organization changed the rules. There's no question. But so in completely different issues. So the DOJ lawsuit, antitrust suit, is completely different and completely separate than this. So when the Department of Justice filed that suit, they also proposed a settlement. They did it all in one day. NAR knew it was coming, but the actions all kind of happened at the same time. They are still working out the settlement because obviously if you've read the stuff, there is stuff in the complaint that is not true in the filing. And I can post it here in the chat if you guys want to read it. But those rules will probably be, I'm guessing, the end of the first quarter before we know. But it wasn't the realtors who said, oh, let's give everybody access to our lock boxes. That's the Department of Justice. And the truth is, you got to, when they tell you to do something, you pretty much have to do it. We don't have a lot of choice in that. But let me ask this question. Do you guys have, I know you've got a regional MLS. Do you have to be a realtor to be in that MLS?
Yes.
Okay. So if your members don't want to be members anymore, can they access the MLS?
No.
If they work for a realtor?
No.
So they're just getting out of the business because they don't like something. And I'll tell you, I don't like it either. I'll be honest. But the truth is, it doesn't affect me. I'm not going to be posting that stuff or saying that stuff or spouting off like that anyway. So, I feel for the members who say, I don't think they should be, just because you can do something doesn't mean you necessarily should. But the truth is, the vote was about 2-1. And it's done. And it doesn't change the way I do my business, and it doesn't change the way I live my life. And it's one of those things, whenever somebody tells you that you cannot do something, it's tough to swallow, whether you would ever do it or not. We're much more independent than that typically. But thanks for bringing those things up, Christina, because I think that that's part of the issue too. But I do think, I mean, I think that members need to reach out to NAR if they've got more questions, if they're unhappy, because this did happen in Realtor world really fast. I mean, between June and November for the National Association of Realtors that's light speed in an organization the size of ours that usually takes years to get something done.
It was a lot of work. There were a lot of.
It was a lot of
meetings
work.
there.
There
Yeah.
were, I think in Terps met 5 or 6 times. Yeah. And every one of those meetings went twice as long as it was supposed to. So yeah, it is a lot of work. And, if it were, if we weren't virtual, it had never gotten done. I don't think it would have gotten done that fast.
Mm-mm. And for those of y'all that don't know, the interpretations committee are basically the wordsmiths. And Stephanie, I do not envy, was on that committee.
Yeah, I've been there for a while. And we typically meet on all day on a Sunday and about 2/3 of a Monday. And we are basically just sitting in a room talking about, looking at what members have sent in that they think needs to be addressed. And then we kind of figure out if it needs to be addressed or if it already is, or if something needs to change. So, and there's 15 of us and from all over the country, and we all meet in Chicago until COVID. And now we all meet from home. So, all right, I'm going to try to put these things in. I think I have them in a place where I can actually access them pretty quickly. I'm not great at this, so.
Well, while Stephanie is doing that, does anybody have any other questions that they would like to ask, either in the chat or a meeting and asking?
All right, let me try it again.
Y'all are a quiet bunch today.
They're a really quiet bunch. I really expected to see more. Okay, I think I'm going to be able to do it. Let's see. I might just have to send you an email because this is not.
Okay, I can send it out for you, not a problem.
Okay.
Heather,
I put all this stuff in Dropbox so I could find it. Oops.
Heather, can you unmute